Heinz is proud to partner The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. Heinz is a leading global real estate investment manager. Heinz owns and operates $93 billion of assets across property types and on behalf of a diverse group of institutional and private wealth clients. Heinz' ambition? Well, in the words of its chairman and CEO Jeffrey Heinz, to be the best real estate investor, manager and partner in the world. Find out how Heinz is making that dream a reality. Head to heinz.com now. Heinz, a leader in real estate investing and management since 1957. Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up.
If you're not working with the cultural folks in your city to solve some of your big problems, I think that's a huge mistake.
We put culture on the agenda as we learn how both artistic offerings and culturally informed urban planning can benefit city dwellers. The editors behind a recent book on cultural urban planning join us to discuss the far-reaching advantages the practice offers to citizens. We also drop by a treasured cultural institution in Peru, and we discuss some of the most exciting new openings on offer around the world. That's all ahead in the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist, with me, Andrew Tuck. Cultural activity in a city doesn't occur by accident, and it also doesn't exist in a vacuum. Cities that practice good urban cultural planning are able to better serve their citizens, both in enriching them on an artistic level, as well as benefiting the city on a more holistic scale. By leveraging cultural practices and learnings, planners can influence everything from housing to transportation to sustainability and health. The recently published Routledge Handbook of Urban Cultural Planning surveys current thinking and best practice to bring forward real-life examples on how to improve a city by embracing culture. To find out more, I'm happy to say I'm joined now by two of the people behind this book. Rana Amirtamasebi, the founding principal of urban strategist ePark, and Jason Schubark, the dean of the Westphal College of Media, Arts and Design at Drexel University. Rana, perhaps I can start with you. Can you tell us first how the handbook came together?
I basically woke up one morning and said, we need a handbook for culture planning. I thought that I could just do a series of blog posts about this because I think 20 years ago, 15 years ago, culture planning was a very limited field. And then now it just seems like it's everywhere. It's basically in every sector that we touch. So I wrote a concept note. And then I had already done a couple of chapters for Routledge. So I sent it to the editors I knew there. And they said, oh, yeah, there's something here. Then I was like, I can't do this by myself. So who's going to help? And then so I wrote to Jason. We have like a shared history, but we actually never worked together before. We had to like peer review the concept note and some more changes and finding the authors and everything. But that's in a nutshell.
A really critical piece of it was our partnership with the World Cities Culture Forum. You know, we approached them pretty early on, and they really gave us access to a ton of amazing authors from around the world. And they represent a lot of the leaders of culture around the world and all the world's greatest cities. So that was a really key part of and they've been a wonderful partner in the book, is what I'd say.
It is a manual. It's there to guide practitioners and to encourage people to look at best practice around the world and to challenge their own thinking. Why do you think it's needed at this point, though, Jason? Because it's interesting, we're just doing a story in the upcoming issue about new museums opening this year, and the roster of projects and cultural projects that are in play are extraordinary. I met with two young architects here in London involved in many cultural projects here in the city yesterday. And again, just the fresh thinking and going around these projects was fascinating. But why did you think that this was the moment for the book?
Well, I always like to say, if you want innovative solutions, you need creative people at the table. And so I think one thing that's been going on for a long time in city planning circles, until really recently, is that culture was kind of an afterthought. Like, oh, we have to focus on jobs or the environment or transportation. And, oh, yeah, there's little cultural projects over there. When the truth is, there's a ton of incredibly deep policy thinking, innovative ideas happening from in this area that really does impact almost every other sector. Like in the book, there's an article about how important this is for democracies, how important culture is for transportation, how important culture is for the climate crisis. There's a whole section on that. So I think anybody who cares about a great city needs to look at all of the tools they have that they can work with. And there's absolutely a role for culture and cultural tools. And this is an incredible survey of incredible minds. There are so many good ideas in here that people can learn from and hopefully dig deeper with. But if you're not working with the cultural folks in your city to solve some of your big problems, you're not. I think that's a huge mistake.
One other thing I want to add, when we talk about arts and culture, we also talk about culture as a way of life, as sort of software for urban development, for upward social mobility. It's not just about high art, it's not just about the museums. It's really about how to build better foundation for people to have upward social mobility.
Tell me, Rana, so what kinds of projects are you covering in the book? Because you make clear there it's not just about museums and it's not just about cultural quarters, it's about all forms of culture. What is the remit of the book then?
That's where I think the challenge was in the beginning. How do we frame all of this? And we have, how much time do you have?
It's only 600 pages.
Let's start on page 1.
So I would say the first theme is arts and planning for equity and social development, creative placemaking, cultural planning for immigrant populations, cultural and mental healing, and artists in government. What's the role? The second theme is planning for and with culture and urban planning. So basically the citywide cultural plans, cultural asset mapping, cultural districts, and integrating culture with transit and housing. The third theme is creative and cultural industries and global tourism planning. And in general, because I started my work in this at the World Bank, where most of the focus was on the economy and economic development through culture. So culture was not really the end, was the means to an end. Creative economy, supporting culture sector during and after the pandemics and wars, specific creative industries, music, film, design, nightlife planning. The next theme is funding and financing culture. And we talk a lot about the cultural land trusts in the US and the UK, guaranteed income, and solidarity economy. The next theme is cultural institutions and buildings, public spaces and public art. So this is where we talk about museums. What is really the future of museums, public art, culture and displacement, regeneration? Cultural heritage is the next theme, which also is something that I personally have worked on a lot. So, how can you use higher education, heritage conversation to come hand in hand? And the last one is culture and the climate crisis. And how can you bring culture in sustainable development, disaster risk management, and indigenous approaches to culture and climate?
A question for both of you. Jason, you're both based in the US. Many of the cultural questions that face particular countries are not the same around the world. The questions, for example, about immigrant communities are important in most countries, but integration of those is challenging or approached in different ways. For example, so if I'm in Qatar or in Dubai thinking about a cultural quarter, maybe the questions that are pertinent to me are not the same as if I'm in the US. But do you think that there are similarities and connections between all these places and the kinds of things they need to start thinking about?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's what we're talking about normalizing these kind of policies is like there are typical steps you should take if you're beginning to do cultural planning that really any community should do. And I think we've learned a lot. I mean, as Rana was saying, I think 20 years ago, you could probably get every cultural planning book on the world's smallest bookshelf and be like, I have the whole thing, Now you can fill libraries, right? There's just an enormous amount of work. This is probably, our book's probably the biggest, not to humble brag, but it's probably the biggest survey in 10 years of this field. But I mean, the nice thing in the book is whatever topic of all those multiple topics that Rana just walked you through, and I was having like hallucinations of the past of like staying up till 3 a.m. editing all the chapters because she went through everything because there's so much. Well, we asked everybody to put at the end of each of their chapter like a lessons learned, like how do I start in this area? So if you are very interested in doing just a cultural plan for your city, we have the two people who did it for New York City, Tom Finkelpearl and Eddie Torres, in conversation with each other, and they give lessons learned about what it was like to do the first ever cultural plan for New York City. If you're interested in nightlife and what it means to like support the city at night, which is a very big movement amongst cities now, we have the people who really pioneered that work, Laia Gash-Caskells, who did that work for the City of London in the book, and she gives lessons learned about it. Think about that. And there's real policies in there, right? Like they started policies about nightclubs and how you preserve nightclubs, and to make sure that the housing, I'm just going to be very practical, like make sure that the housing units that are built around a nightclub have double paned windows, right? Like very practical policies, right? Because they were worried about losing the Ministry of Sound, a legendary nightclub. But there's a lot of chapters on cultural districts. There's a whole group that actually we worked with called the Global Districts Network that we're another partner on the book. They had read several articles about kind of in Dubai, if you're trying to build a cultural district, what are the kind of things you could think about? There's a great survey of sustainability in cultural districts, which I think is a big issue going forward, looking at what are cultural districts doing to make sure that they are both physically sustainable and financially sustainable. And so there's a lot in there that people can really start with. And there are very practical, real policies in there.
And Rana, tell me, you mentioned earlier on the kinds of things you're approaching here, and one of them you mentioned was its impact on climate change and how culture can segue into that debate. Give us some examples of how does that work? Why is it important to think about the two in tandem?
Well, I think that you are probably familiar with the UNESCO's approach to this. They call it cultural landscapes. So basically, when you look at historic towns or historic settlements, culture and environment were always hand in hand. You build because the environment tells you to build the way you're building. So we have one chapter here that exactly, explains that, but mostly in terms of like indigenous populations within the US. There are a lot of regenerative practices when it comes to the land, when it comes to resources that, they're disappearing. Like one of the things that, I don't know, this is a little bit of an anecdote, a personal anecdote, but one of the things that I do completely subconsciously is that in Iran, where I'm from, we don't throw away bread because it's so hard to make bread. So if you see a piece of bread on the street, you put it either in the water, you give it back to the nature, or you make sure that you never walk on it or you never put it in the trash. And my kids who are half American and very little are now doing that. And I realize I've been doing this very subconsciously. And this is kind of like a very basic way to say, I know that it took a lot to build this bread and I don't want to waste it. So these types of attitudes, I think, especially in the Western world, are being ignored. I personally believe to be able to challenge climate change, we need to have some regenerative practices, some reduction in our consumption of the resources. And I think that is only possible if we look at the indigenous knowledge and culture.
Jason, when you were up at 3 o'clock in the morning editing and when Rana had sent you another script to look at, were there some aha moments? Were there any standout examples of best practice or of innovation that really kind of sat with you?
Gosh, well, I hope your listeners want to sit down for 4 hours while I bore them to death with policy. No, there's so much. So most of my practice, because I used to work at the National Endowment for the Arts, and I led a lot of place-based work there during the Obama era and just the beginning of the first Trump administration. My knowledge base about the states and the practices that were happening in the states was like crazy deep. And the thing that was really interesting to me was all the international practice that Rana really brought to the table. So, we would have some really interesting conversations and arguments, like she just said, about like, that's a Western perspective, that because I would say, well, we really need to include this factor in this thing. And she'd be like, the people in Iran don't care about that. They weren't fights, I promise. But there's a lot of really one thing that's very interesting to me is about how and where cultural policy lives in cities. And I will say in a lot of the non-Western world, it does show up as heritage planning, right? Like if you're really trying to understand basic cultural planning stuff, like you actually have to go looking very deeply at heritage policy. And so one of the last articles in our book is a book about climate and conservation in India. And it really looks through the lens of heritage policy and planning, because that's the only policies that are there, right? That relate to this at all, and how artists can get involved in preserving these communities. How does heritage affect these communities? Because there's just nothing else on the books. So I found that extremely interesting. There's some great articles on preserving historic towns in Latin American communities that I found super interesting. There's an amazing article by Gabriela Gomez Mont, who ran this cultural innovation office for the city of Mexico City. And they did absolutely incredible work across Mexico City, doing place-based installations, inspiring people to think different about the city through art. That article is like a mind blower, and she is truly a genius. So yeah, I can go on and on about the amazing things that have happened in America, but for me in this process, what was more interesting is just like the incredible stuff that's happening all over the world and the way it shows up so differently than in our Western society.
Ryan, we're almost at the end of the interview, but I wanted to ask a slightly tangential question, which is, it seems that culture is being asked to do a lot of heavy lifting here, to ease society's pains, to bring people together, to revitalise communities, to reignite interest in downtowns, to do so much work. Do you think there's still, in a pure sense, a space for joy and for pure enjoyment here as well? I wondered whether in all the planning and all the cultural policy that gets laden on these days, whether those things that really do pull us out into the street to see culture and to be engaged and to love things can be celebrated as well.
Yes. I mean, from my personal experience in the past few years, I've worked in Ghana, 2 cities in Ghana with World Heritage Sites, Northern Cyprus, which is a site for conflict right now. We're doing a project right now in Gaza looking at cultural heritage. And I can tell you that in all these places, doesn't matter if there's poverty, if there's conflict, if there's disasters, people take pride. And I would say that's the only guiding principle. That's the only thing that basically tells them there is hope and you can get through this. And the fact that people are so insistent on keeping their cultural practices alive kind of blows my mind. So yes, I think a lot of these are very applicable. And that's the whole point. If there's no joy, then why are we doing this? There's definitely joy. I mean, again, a personal anecdote. I grew up in a war, and I remember every time we had a bombing, right after the bombing, we would turn on the lights because you have to turn off the lights when the bombs are there. We would turn on the lights and we'd just start dancing. Everybody, I was a kid, but my mom, dad, grandmother, this is how we survived. So I think that's the whole point of it in the end.
I agree so much. I mean, we are allowed to have joy. Artists should bring joy. It should be, I want Beyonce to bring me joy. Okay. That should be allowed. So, and I think when people try to other culture as part of policy, they're forgetting about it is a fundamental way to connect with humans at their most human level, right? And people will be like, I don't participate in the arts. I'm like, do you sing in your church? Then you participate in the arts, right? And so I think everybody has a cultural practice, whether they know it or not, and whether it's defined as cultural practice or not, and those are the things that accessing that and that power, that connection to our most humanness is the way that we're going to go forward here. And that's why I think it's so important.
Jason Schubach and Rana Amirtamasebi, my thanks to them both. The Routledge Handbook of Urban Cultural Planning is out now and available via routledge.com. Next up today, we visit one cultural institution in the Peruvian city of Lima. Elna Schutz takes us to a museum in the city whose pre-Columbian collection tells enthralling tales of the evolution of the area.
There's a long white wall in the quiet suburb of Pueblo Libre in Lima that appears unassuming but holds many historical and artistic treasures. As a tourist in Peru, you will likely hear a lot about the Spanish conquest, but there's a whole wealth of history from before Europeans arrived that is often overlooked. Yes, there were the Incas, but a number of other pre-Columbian societies too. The Laco Museum is exactly the place to discover this. The compound itself is beautiful to look at. The gardens are draped in colourful flowers, from bougainvilleas to clivias, and birds sing in the trees. It's a calm and refreshing spot, even with the buzz of construction and traffic close by. Despite celebrating the more distant past, the building itself is from the 18th century in the style of Peruvian vice royalty, but the collection was moved here from the north of the country. Step through a quaint tiled courtyard into the main gallery and learn about civilizations from possibly as early as 10,000 years ago. The museum was founded in the 1920s by the fairly young Rafael Larco-Hoyle, now considered one of the pioneers of Peruvian archaeology. He acquired several archaeological collections and took part in digs himself, bringing together a collection of a stunning number of over 44,000 pieces. As he started cataloguing them, he realized that many of them were likely from cultures not yet described. Thus, he is seen as the discoverer of several ancient cultures. The artifacts include tapestries, pottery, and metalwork from different regions and reveal secrets of the beliefs and practices. Many of the objects were related to funerals and ceremonies, since honouring the dead appeared to be a large part of these societies. For instance, you'll notice a pattern of 3 sacred animals. A bird of prey represents the world above or the heavens, a cat-like animal like a puma represents the earth, and a snake shows the underworld. This pot here shows one combined creature. It has owl-like eyes, the 4 feet of a cat, and a snake-like tail, likely showing a deity that represents all 3 worlds. In the later room of tapestries, I am particularly interested not in the intricate patterns, but in a display of simple long threads spread out like rays and each having carefully placed knots. These were used for record-keeping of the Incas, though it's not entirely clear of what. It might have been of family ancestry or types of work. The harsher realities of death and war are not shied away from throughout the history and different materials. Particularly notable is the mummy that takes up the central place in one of the halls. At first it appears to be of a very large adult, but this is only for show, as the actual skeleton, still mummified and unwrapped to this day, is likely of an ill child. Peru is also known for its gold and silver craftsmanship, which is proudly displayed in the jewelry of warriors and nobles. A particularly fascinating part of the museum is the archival store. It holds thousands of clay pots that were found in tombs to represent all kinds of things that were important to the dead. Everything from vegetables to cats. But walk through the garden to a more hidden exhibit in the lower corner and you'll likely be astounded, if not at least giggle. This is where the erotic exhibit is. The collection is unique in that these funeral pots and other clay items were kept throughout the rather conservative Catholic Spanish invasion. Thus you can now still see the, shall I say, very detailed and sexual depictions on the pots. My tour guide insists that the majority of this is to represent fertility in the agricultural sense, but some of the scenes displayed would make even the most free-thinking farmer blush, I'm sure. Here in this peaceful spot, the unusual and incredible mysteries of the past seem at once completely out of step with the Spanish style, and yet oddly at home, tucked away into corner after corner with beauty. It's just like Lima to keep you guessing.
My thanks to Elna Schutz there for that report. As mentioned earlier, we've been looking at some exciting new cultural openings from around the world in the most recent edition of Monocle magazine, and also looking at how they can positively impact their surrounding cities. So finally today, our culture editor, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, is here to explain more. Sophie, can you tell us how you put together this survey and what kinds of places that you found?
2025 feels like a year with just so many cultural openings, and they're in places all over the world of completely different scales and focus. But also what I think is quite interesting is that they're coming from different places. So some of them are completely state-run, they're coming from the government. Some of them are grassroots organisations that are really community-led and community-based. And then some of them are more kind of private enterprise. So that was particularly interesting. And I did as much research as possible into which ones are opening this year. And then I chose a mix of 6 of my kind of favourites that I thought were really place-based, were bringing something new to a city or a country and the cultural scene there, but also that were kind of different to each other. So we most often associate museums with kind of historical artefacts and things like that, or with art. But in here we've got a hip-hop museum, which is a really fascinating opening. We've got one in Lisbon that you can stay in, so it's a bit of a kind of hotel hybrid. So they're just, I feel like there's both a lot of openings, but also a lot of creativity into what makes a museum, which is really exciting.
Well, why don't we start with the Hip Hop Museum, because it's opening in New York. And first of all, I think there's a theme that pops up here, how a good cultural institution is a bit of storytelling for a place as well. So obviously hip hop, born out of New York, but hasn't really been celebrated in this way. Perhaps hard sometimes when you think of something as being a sound more than a visual thing, but of course it is very visual hip-hop. Tell us a little bit about this museum.
This museum sounds amazing. So it's in the Bronx. It's right in the kind of center of where hip hop came from. It's very community led. A lot of the people who are leading the museum are kind of were pioneers when hip hop sort of emerged 50 years ago. And what I think is really amazing about it, both, you'll go and you'll see amazing kind of photos, you'll have rare vinyls and things like that, but you'll also be able to listen to a lot of the early sounds of hip hop. And one thing that I think is great is that there's also an in-house radio station and there's a theatre. And so they're really planning on having icons from hip hop, but also supporting the local community and giving back to young people in the area who want to go into music. And so I think that's a theme that I'm kind of seeing a lot within these sort of cultural openings, that it's not just about preserving the past and becoming institutions that kind of put things in vitrines and they stay there and you go and you look at them, but they're really engaging and they're really thinking about the future and thinking about how do we preserve these kind of cultural artifacts, but also looking to the future and how we can support young people who are interested in, for example, hip hop going into the future.
There's lots of great links you're throwing up here, but one of them is with the Phoenix Museum that's going to be opening in the Netherlands. Now, here you have a project based in Rotterdam, a port city, that's looking at migration. And, migration in two ways. Migration is a thing to be celebrated, how it brings talent and wealth to all those who participate if it goes well, but also the darker sides of migration now and in the past when people were traded and all sorts of things. And ports being one of those places that are very much connected with all the pluses and minuses of migration. It's an extraordinary project to come to life. What are they trying to do here?
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's not just a museum that's kind of telling the story of migration, particularly in terms of the Netherlands, but it's about celebrating migration and the movement of people over time. As you say, it's based in Rotterdam. I think it's very interesting under the current Dutch government to have such a big statement that celebrates migration at the moment. I think that's quite interesting politically. And yeah, they're kind of using both artifacts, talking about people going from the Netherlands to the New World in the past, but also kind of artistically engaging with migration. And there's lots of different kind of installations, sculptures, and it's really kind of all-encompassing. So I think that's a particularly exciting project. There's also in Rotterdam, if we're talking about kind of cities evolving and how cultural institutions bring a bit of new life to cities, Rotterdam is really interesting because they are currently completing an enormous photo museum there, which will be the National Photography Museum of the Netherlands. And so I think in general, Rotterdam is somewhere that's really evolving and really making the most of these kind of giant cultural projects.
Now, not all of these projects are sitting in successful, wealthy European cities. There are many thriving cities around the world that are also opening new resources this year. And one of those is in Nigeria, in Benin City. And what's interesting here is, that one of the reasons, again, they're doing it is they want to put the spotlight on themselves and say, look, we have incredible talent here. We should be part of all of these dialogues about art and culture. We want this institution to put a spotlight on the city and best practice here and also enable us to promote research and develop as a cultural centre as well.
Yeah, I think the Museum of West African Art that you mentioned in Benin City, which is kind of slowly opening, it's got lots of different elements to it, and it's been opening over the past couple of years, and its kind of main gallery will open this summer. When I spoke to the directors there, they immediately said, look, we are not somewhere that is planning on playing host to the Benin bronzes. We're not building somewhere to bring them back to Nigeria. That is not the goal. And I think that's a really good example of they're just looking to the future and they're actually trying to do something which is way more ambitious. They will be showing typical West African artifacts, and you'll learn a lot about Nigerian and West African history if you visit, but also they are making science labs and research facilities, and they're really focused on supporting contemporary artists in the region, but also researchers and archivists, and they're making an entire all-encompassing facility in which to do that, and it's just really future-looking.
Well, thank you, Sophie. Now, the February issue is on sale now, and as well as this guide to the big institutions opening, Sophie's commissioned a great essay from Rob Bound, which looks at why coming into physical space to experience culture is vital, and not just seeing things online and being in a digital world. So the idea of seeing things with other people around you. So a great issue, and we hope you enjoy it. Well, that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. You can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. This episode of The Urbanist was produced by Carlo Torabello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.